Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. Today I want to talk about different types of writers. So I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I've noticed that some writers will find certain techniques eye-opening and just completely beneficial in every way, and other writers will find those same techniques stifling, uninspiring, unhelpful, maybe even setting them back instead of forward. So I wanted to come up with a typing system for writers that would help them to identify what types of strategies and techniques they should listen to and what types they can disregard, because everything just doesn't work for everyone. And if we all try to follow the same rules and the same systems, it's just going to be a struggle. So I came up with 4 different types, and I believe that if you can identify the type that is the closest to you, you might waffle between 2 different types, and I think that would be very normal. You might also change types or come to a realization that this type kind of worked for you, but this other type is actually a better fit, and I think that that may be a natural progression over time as well. So I don't want you to feel pigeonholed into your type or that everything about that type has to fit you exactly correctly. But I think that if you can type yourself, it will help you to figure out the strategies and the techniques that will work for you. And I think that will also help you to stay motivated, because you won't be butting up against tactics or techniques that are really just holding you back or making the process more difficult for you. I'll be posting follow-up videos that go into more detail about each of the types, so I'll be making a video for the strategies and techniques that will and won't work for each type. But in this video, I just want to go over what the types are, what my reasoning was behind the different types, and how you can start to identify which type you think that you are, so that you can find the strategies and techniques that will work best for you. So I came up with this idea based on 2 different continuums. So before I get into the 4 types, I want to go over the 2 continuums that I'm using to come up with the types. So the first continuum is plotter versus pantser. So if you are on the far side and you are an extreme plotter, you're the type of person who's going to benefit from breaking down every little nuanced element of your story in advance. So on this far, far, far end, you might have absolutely everything broken down, the emotional shift for every scene. You might have every subplot tracked. You might know every relationship and how it develops across the story. You might have an elaborate world-building Bible. You might have multiple tracking systems or different softwares and lots of different techniques that you're using to make everything line up, and you know exactly what the book is going to be before you start writing the first draft. On the far extreme, on the other side, you have someone who is a complete pantser. So a pantser is someone who flies by the seat of their pants. They're not going into the first draft with any sort of plan at all. On this extreme end, they're going in just completely with essentially nothing, maybe a spark of inspiration, a line that they thought of that really inspires them, or maybe a character that inspires them, but they haven't done pre-writing, planning, plotting. They're flying by the seat of their pants. Somewhere around in the middle, you might have someone who has the gist of the plot. They might have jotted down their main ideas or objectives, so they have a little bit of a mix. They have some plotting done, but they're really going into the first draft without a ton of planning or an elaborate breakdown. They just have a little bit of an idea. So I think most writers tend to tip one way or the other on this continuum. It is important to keep in mind that what I'm talking about with the writing types is what works best for you, and that might not necessarily be the method that you prefer or the method that you find the most fun. In my experience, most writers want to be pantsers. It seems more fun, not having to do the planning and the plotting in advance. On the other hand, I have also seen people who are the more creative pantsing type, who sort of need to have their story unfold as they go, but for whatever reason they feel like they need to outline or plot in advance, and that can also be detrimental. So one side isn't better than the other. It's just a matter of which side actually works for you. If you're not sure which type you are, if you're not sure if you're a plotter or a pantser, one way to sort of assess that is if you attempt to plot and you plan everything in advance, and then when you write your story, you deviate constantly, you're just never sticking to the plan, that could be a sign that you would do better as a pantser. Another big sign, probably the biggest sign that I tend to notice, is after the writer outlines, they just don't want to write the story anymore. The inspiration is completely gone. They don't feel creative. They just have no investment anymore. They don't want to do it anymore. So if that's you, then you're probably a pantser and not a plotter. If you think you're a pantser and you're not, what usually will happen is you won't get very far into your stories. You'll write a few thousand words and then get stuck. You don't know what should happen next, and you just put it away and you never pick it up again. Or you might be the type of writer who starts novels constantly. You're constantly starting a new one, but you're never getting past that initial setup or that initial few thousand words. So that's a good sign that you need to plot and that you're losing direction. So that's the first continuum. The second continuum is intuitive versus methodological. So an intuitive writer on the far, far, far side is going to be very artistic, gut feeling, emotional. They are thinking with their heart or thinking with their intuition, and that's how they plot, it's how they edit, it's how they solve their problems. So they don't need or don't rely on understanding theories or anything like that. It's all about their gut. On the other side, on the far, far, far other side, you have extreme methodological types, people who know every literary theory, who use very elaborate structuring systems, who understand the ins and outs of all elements of literature. So they might break down the character arc components, they might break down every scene and all the structure. And again, I'm not talking about plotting, I'm just talking about understanding it and knowing it. So they're thinking, whether they're plotting or not, they're using their head versus the intuitive type is using their heart or their gut. So the main difference that you'll see between these types, because both types can plot, both types can pants or fly by the seat of their pants, the main difference is the intuitive type will figure out problems and solve problems based on their feelings and their gut, and the methodological writers will figure it out based on theories, based on ideas, concepts, things that they have figured out. So plot structure, scene structure, character arc, etc. If you think that you're intuitive type and you are not intuitive type, you'll tend to write stories that are very boring, very meandering, very scattered, lacking in focus, lacking in vision. That's all a really good sign that you need more technique and that you just don't have that gut instinct as to when things are working or aren't working. You might know that something's not working, but you don't know why. You're not really instinctually solving problems. If you're spending huge amounts of time editing and you never really feel like you're getting anywhere, that's a good sign that you're not really intuitive. If you think that you're the methodological type, but you're actually intuitive type, you can usually tell because you'll already know if a story works or not before you apply techniques like structure to the story. You'll already know if it works. You can already feel that it works or that it doesn't work. Alternatively, you might find that even when you know that a story works, you cannot explain it with structure. You can't apply structure. Even when people might say, here's the structure of a story, it isn't making sense to you. It makes sense to you intuitively. You're like, yeah, this story is great. It works. I like it. It holds up. But the logical level of thinking about it, it doesn't work for you. It isn't helping you. It isn't assisting you in any way, and it may just never make sense to you. And it's completely fine to be on either side. I don't want anyone to feel like this side sounds better or this side sounds better. They're extreme pros and cons to both sides. So I'm just trying to present unbiasedly what those two sides might look like. Another major difference that you'll notice between the intuitive type and the methodological type is that a methodological type writer, when they learn about theories, structure, technique, things like that, they get excited. Their eyes are open. They're like, wow, I get this. This makes sense. This helps me so much. Versus the intuitive type might say, this feels really restrictive, or this doesn't feel right to me, or this makes me really uncomfortable. I feel like I can't do what I want to do. Like this isn't adding up to me. It's a difference in perception of the story, going with your gut versus going with your head. And I think that is often the most obvious difference. But again, we're not talking about preference, and we're not talking about not liking to learn structure. So if you've never tried to learn structure or scene structure, character arc components, things like that, if you've never tried, or if you found it difficult and gave up, that's not the same thing as being intuitive. Make sure that you give it a significant try, because I would say in general, methodological type is probably at least a little bit more common. But I think most writers tend to like the idea of being intuitive. So just make sure that you are giving it a genuine try before you're writing off the methodological type. So if we take these two continuums and we put them together, we end up with the 4 different types of writers. So there's the intuitive pantser, the intuitive plotter, the methodological plotter, and the methodological pantser. So now that we've gone over the continuums, the general definitions, and the 4 different types, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what the profiles of these different types would look like so that you can better identify yourself. So the first type that I want to go over is the intuitive pantser. Now, this is probably the most romanticized type of writer. This is the type who's going to go in with little to no plan, fly by the seat of their pants. They may intuitively apply structure in odd or unusual ways. They may also be able to better compensate naturally when they're not really following scene structure or not really following plot structure. So they're more able, because they're going with their gut or their intuition, they're more able to come up with creative or unusual ways for the story to flow that they don't even necessarily realize that that's what they're doing. And then it would make more methodological types have a complete meltdown trying to analyze, how did they make this work? Because it doesn't seem like it should work on the surface. So I think that's an interesting element of the intuitive pantser type. This type is probably the rarest, but I think it's the type that most writers want to be, because it's just such an appealing idea that you could just sit down with a Word document and write out your novel, and it's just beautiful and artistic. But this is a very rare type. This would, I think, almost be like being a prodigy. This is very unusual. Potential downsides for this type mainly have to do with a long time spent in editing. The combination of going with your gut, which typically can make problem solving take a little bit longer. You might have to do more soul searching, more thinking. That combined with winging the first draft, it can be a very long process for this type of writer to go from starting the novel to the finished draft. So the next type is the intuitive plotter. So an intuitive plotter still has that same intuition and gut feeling about stories, but they may have a hard time sparking that intuition over a very long work. So they may have a hard time reining in their ideas, shaping those ideas, or holding all of the components in their head. So the intuitive plotter does benefit a lot from plotting in advance, but they won't do so based on techniques or methods or structure. They'll do so based on their own intuition. So a really good strategy for this type might be to write a summary, a very creative sort of summary of what the story is going to be, and that helps them to sort of shrink it down, clarify their vision, but they don't need to follow any sort of rigid structure to do that. The intuitive plotter tends to be a good problem solver on an intuitive level. If you find that that's not really the case, that you get stuck in the plotting process and you can never really get to a point where you feel like it works. For example, maybe you're always shuffling scenes around and you're like, maybe this will work, maybe that'll work, but ultimately you never come up with an outline that you're happy with. You're probably methodological. You're probably not intuitive. If when you're creating this outline or the synopsis and you're having these eureka moments where you're like, yeah, that's it, it's perfect, I love it, it works really well, you're probably more intuitive. Of course, both types can experience that, but if you find that that's more often your experience, then that's a good indicator that you're intuitive. So the third type is the methodological plotter. So these are the extreme planners. They have many things planned in advance. They use scene structure, story structure, character arc components. They have everything really broken down and they really have a good sense going in of everything they want to accomplish. In a lot of ways, this type of writer is editing in advance. They're thinking through all of their different ideas and how they all fit together and how do all these pieces slot in, what doesn't slot in, what can I throw away, and they're coming up with a plan that is they're pretty sure is cohesive before they write the first draft. So one of the upsides of this type is that they usually don't have to do a lot of editing because they've done most of that work already. A good sign that you are not this type is if you go through all this process of plotting and breaking down all of the different elements, and then you don't want to work on the book anymore. You're just done with it. There's no life left in it. You feel so constrained by this outline that you feel like you can't be creative anymore. It's not fun or exciting. And of course, at times, writing is always going to be not fun and exciting at times, but if it's paralyzing you and you're like, I don't even want to look at this anymore, or I don't want to work on this, this is a good sign that this is not your type. Methodological plotters sometimes will say things like they're not real writers or they don't feel like real writers. This is complete nonsense. Just because you need to plan in advance doesn't mean you're not a real writer. A lot of people will tell you, or I've heard a lot of people say things like real writers don't need to break down their stories into components, or real writers don't need to outline, or things like that. That's just nonsense. The strong point of the methodological plotter is once they come up with a system that works for them, they are usually the most prolific. So they're able to churn out books a lot faster than the other types because they're able to come up with a system that works for them. They can stick to it, and then they can produce. So the last type is the methodological pantser. This type might seem like an oxymoron because you think, well, if they're methodological, why wouldn't they plot? Why wouldn't they apply these things in advance? But this is the type of writer who needs to see something on the page in order to start developing their vision. So they might do a little planning, do a little writing, do a little planning, do a little writing, break down the structure, do some more writing, go back and change the first 4 chapters, change it in their plotting outline or whatever they're using. And so they might be plotting and writing simultaneously, and they might be doing a sort of back and forth kind of switch between editing and writing. So you're sort of going between doing and planning back and forth throughout the whole process. So it's a very interesting type. They may essentially be editing and plotting and writing all at the same time, but they need to do that in order to wrap their brain around what they're trying to accomplish. So don't let people make you feel bad if this is your type. It's a valid type. A lot of writing advice might not apply to this type when it comes to always plot in this way or never edit as you go. But this type is definitely common. And if you can embrace this process, it is a chaotic process, but if you can embrace this chaotic process, you can definitely produce very strong, competent novels. So I really hope you found this video helpful. I'll be back soon with videos for each of the individual types so we can talk about strategies and specific techniques that you would find most beneficial. In the meantime, let me know in the comments what type you think you are. Let me know if you think there are any other types, or maybe you don't fit into any of the types. I'm really curious what your thoughts are. And I did just hit 100,000 subscribers. I'm super excited. I really can't believe it. And thank you guys so much for your support. Let me know how you want to celebrate. I know some of you mentioned a Q&A. I don't really have the ability to do a live Q&A, but let me know if you're interested in a pre-recorded Q&A, and I will try to make plans for that soon. So happy writing, guys.